Hello everyone and welcome back into yet another edition of the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard as always. Thank you all for tuning in to today's show, and it should be a good one here on this Tuesday afternoon of February 11th. We'll be starting off by talking about my own personal QB big board. Not necessarily the guys we expect to go that highly. We are going to talk about Cam Ward a little bit, but some of the guys potentially going in later rounds who might potentially see their stock either rise or plummet as we continue with these combine workouts, we continue with these bowls, continue with such and such. So it should be an interesting segment. Then we can talk about the potential Cooper Kupp landing spots. Myles Garrett not the only high-profile star on the trade market right now. A lot of interesting places he could end up. Then we'll be previewing tonight's Knicks-Pacers showdown. Very different tenor to it than the playoff series last year. Then when we start doing a new segment here on the show called Bubble Watch, we're getting into March Madness territory here, folks. So throughout this entire week, I'm going to be updating you on the teams currently on, potentially the outside looking in a lot of different conferences. And today we start off with perhaps the most top-heavy of those conferences, the SEC. And we conclude by looking at tomorrow's slate, because today's slate is going to be happening throughout our show of Champions League knockout playoff phase games. A lot of interesting ones tomorrow. Maybe not the best, considering the fact that Real Madrid and Man City's contest is just kicking off in a couple of minutes, but ultimately should still be a good segment to close out today's show. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you, as always, to like, follow, and subscribe if you haven't done so already and you want to keep up to date with all our new content, not just from my show, but around the network. And also consider availing yourselves to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube to contribute and interact with the show a little bit more directly. As always, the best way to get your opinions, feedback, and input out there, as always, just makes our shows that much better. But without further ado, let's jump right into our first segment, our own personal QB big board here at the show, and it should be a good one. Like I said, we're going to be talking about a guy like Cam Ward, what his draft stock is going to be looking like over the next couple of months, but ultimately some other guys, two other guys who I'm really interested to see in terms of their draft stock over the coming months before the draft, because they really are intriguing. And considering the fact that the landscape of this QB class is not necessarily groundbreaking, I do feel like the guys we'll be talking about outside of Cam Ward have a better chance of getting picked a little bit earlier than one would expect, because of this very thin QB market in this year's draft. So without further ado, let's start talking about them. First, though, we do have to talk about Mr. Cam Ward, because he is considered QB1 or QB2 if you think Shedeur Sanders is better in this year's draft class. But I'm not necessarily certain both the Titans and Browns are the top picks in the draft and are potentially teams looking to be in the quarterback market are content on picking him or someone like an Abdul Carter or Travis Hunter to improve their team. So let's talk about Cam Ward, because he's going to be an interesting prospect. A lot of people still view him as potentially being the number one overall pick. But right now, considering the fact that we've heard so many different rumors about both the Titans and Browns, two teams who could be in the Cam Ward sweepstakes at the top of the draft, I feel like his chances of falling a little bit lower than we would expect, potentially all the way to the Giants at 3, or maybe even lower if other teams consider taking the best player available ahead of, say, more QB-needy teams like the Raiders, so to speak. Then this could be an interesting situation where Ward could see not necessarily his draft stock plummet, but the number that he's called at plummet. And it's nothing against him, right? If you draft him, you're getting an incredible prospect with a steely demeanor in big moments, the leading passer last year in the FBS, the leading passing touchdown guy in terms of how many he had, and he just creates in certain moments that you want him to. Yes, there are caveats in terms of his decision making. He makes some head scratching plays, but you are still getting perhaps the most elite QB in this draft, a guy who certainly, if you develop enough around him, could be your franchise QB for years to come. But whether or not he's number one is going to be the question. I think that the Titans are a team that are getting a little iffy about whether or not they want to retain their number one pick or potentially use it on someone else outside of the QB market. They are a very QB needy team, but maybe Travis Hunter, Abdul Carter appeals to them a bit more. They have a lot of areas of need, so Cam Ward might not necessarily be in their minds as of right now. And if they trade out of the pick, they might just look for free agency to help them out at the QB spot. A lot of talk about potentially Aaron Rodgers using that as a surprise destination to go to, but who knows? And then the Browns, yes, they're also a QB needy team, but because of Deshaun's immovable contract at this point, and because of the fact that Myles Garrett is requesting a trade, they could go for someone like an Abdul Carter right now, should they lose Garrett. So right now, the team is most likely in on Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, so to speak, are the Giants and Raiders. And for both those fan bases, it falls out exactly like they would want him to. But for Cam Ward, it's going to be interesting to see if the Titans and Browns even consider thinking about him as well. But for now, he's a prospect who remains the QB1 in this class, but it depends on whether or not the Titans or Browns are willing to risk their franchises, basically, on this guy. Probably in a different class who wouldn't necessarily be in this conversation right now. Now let's talk about another guy, potentially quickly becoming the QB3, rising up a lot of people's draft board, potentially into the first round, where a team like, say, a Pittsburgh takes a risk on him. How about Jackson Dart? And speaking of how he rose the ranks to potentially become the QB3 in this year's draft is through the Senior Bowl. Really impressed a lot of people with his arm strength and verticality at the Senior Bowl. But ultimately, concerns have arisen around him, considering the fact that he was more so in a scheme under Lane Kiffin that tailored to the college game a little bit more than, say, a pro-style offense. So that's going to be a big question that he has to answer continuously, not just in a Senior Bowl setting against the top talent in college, but in combine workouts and in other areas of his draft process. Because as much as Jackson Dart has really been impressive, one of the top QBs in the SEC over the past 2 years, perhaps in many people's minds the top QB in the SEC over the past couple of years. And we know he has the arm strength. We know he has the accuracy to all different levels of the field. It's going to come down to how he begins to process the jump from college to the NFL. It's going to intrigue a lot of teams if he gets that part of the process right. But for now, he remains a bit of a question mark in terms of his draft stock, to me, at the very least, because a lot of people see him rising up the rankings. But to me, I still feel he's a little bit of an unknown entity until we start to see how evaluators and scouts view him in the draft process. So for now, I'm putting a question mark next to his QB3 status, and I want to see more out of his workouts, his interviews over the next couple of months to assure that he deserves to be in the QB3 conversation behind Ward and Sanders, potentially a late day one pick. But for now, I really think that Jackson Dart has set a platform for himself that he wants to cross over. And if he crosses over that platform, that threshold, he could potentially be a sneaky option for some teams looking towards the bottom of round one. And it could lead to a shock pickup from a team like, say, Pittsburgh or even Seattle, or maybe even a surprise team as well, down low in these rankings for, actually not the rankings, but the round. But ultimately, I still am a little bit iffy about how he's going to transition to the NFL. But he's an interesting guy that I wanted to bring up outside of the big two, outside of some guys who, might be appealing later, say, in round 5, because he has truly cemented himself as the questionable QB3. And I want to call that into question. Now let's get to a guy whose status really is up in the air, hovering around QB7 right now. I know him all too well, Quinn Ewers. And this is a guy whose draft stock can change mightily over the next couple of months. whether it be through his interviews where scouts and evaluators will probably most likely fall in love with him, and then in his combine workouts where he's sure to show he's not just part of a scheme that Sark set up for him with his arm strength. And the most important aspect of why evaluators and scouts love his games, because in the big moments he did show up. For example, against Alabama on the road his junior year, probably his best performance in the Big 12 championship game, the most passing yards in a game of his career. And then against Arizona State in the critical moments, 4th and 13, gotta have a moment, he delivered as well, in both overtimes for that matter. But then again, we look at Sark's scheme, when we look at how it became a little bit more run heavy, we look at how Quinn started to throw a lot of passes behind the line of scrimmage, especially last year. We talk about all the injuries that might have impacted how accurate, how deep he can throw the football. We talk about, all of those aspects of his game. That's the reason why a lot of people are saying that he might fall a bit lower, but potentially in terms of the combine aspects of it, in terms of how he works out, in terms of how he interviews, in terms of how he appeals to, say, the average NFL scout, that's where it could get intriguing. Because a lot of people are saying that Quinn Ewers is most likely a round 4 to 5 guy because of the way he's handled himself throughout his college career, because of the big moments in his college career, because of the way he's handled this arch situation, especially because of how he handled himself in front of the media, dealing with that. Maybe that appeals to more NFL scouts who like that part of a quarterback's attitude, like that part of a quarterback's makeup more than, say, the average pundit who is just viewing it through their play and their style of play, most importantly, that makes Quinn Ewers such an unknown. I think that because of the fact that evaluators and scouts are most likely going to fall in love with him throughout the process, that we could see him enter the late round 2, early day 3 debate here. So I think that out of all these 3 quarterbacks, Quinn Ewers could prove to be the most volatile in terms of where he goes. But I didn't want to present all of these 3 guys because even though we talked about Cam Ward first and he's most likely going to be the first QB off the board, I wanted to bring up both Dart and Ewers because they're the most volatile in my opinion in terms of where they could end up. Let me know what you think in the comments below about these 3 quarterbacks, where they could end up going, and whether or not you think their draft stock will rise or plummet, because coming up next, we transition to another topic concerning the NFL, where Cooper Kupp might end up out on the trade market. It should be a good one right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign.